Democrats in the American Joint Economic Committee have released a report raising concerns about declining Canadian visitors due, they say, to President Donald Trump's actions. The report says the negative impacts of President Trump's tariff policies have been particularly stark in states along the U.S.-Canada border.
Here's the headline Washington didn't want to hear today. A new U.S. Congressional report confirms that Canadian tourists are disappearing from America, and U.S. businesses are the ones paying the price. The United States is discovering something it hasn't had to confront in a long time. When Canada steps back, America feels it in its wallet. This isn't a symbolic dispute or a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is a measurable, painful, self-inflicted wound created by President Donald Trump's own tariff and border policies.
The report, released by Democrats on the U.S. Joint Economic Committee, paints a clear picture of a shrinking Canadian presence across America's northern border regions. In Maine, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is reporting nearly a 20% drop in crossings compared to last year. The ferry route connecting Yarmouth, Nova Scotia to Bar Harbor, Maine, usually packed during summer, saw a similar slide in passengers. For restaurants, hotels, retail outlets, and seasonal attractions, this decline has been nothing short of devastating. Local leaders have not minced words. Yarmouth's mayor says that 98% of what's happening is due to Trump's policies, while business owners in Maine and New Hampshire complain of quieter streets, emptier parking lots, and a summer season that simply never arrived. And the numbers confirm the stakes. Canadian tourism contributes more than $20 billion to the U.S. economy each year and supports around 140,000 American jobs. Even though Canadians represent only a portion of total visitors, their economic impact is disproportionately large, especially in small towns where weekend trips from New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario used to fill cash registers. Now, that flow has slowed to a crawl.
This is where the story turns from tourism statistics into a lesson in geopolitical leverage. Trump's second-term America First doctrine was designed to force manufacturing and consumption back onto U.S. soil. The tariffs placed on Canadian goods, the hostile rhetoric toward allies, and the tougher screening policies at the border were all meant to signal strength. Instead, they triggered something Washington didn't game out: millions of Canadians quietly choosing to stay home, spend elsewhere, and avoid the United States altogether. What makes this moment remarkable is that Canada didn't retaliate in any orchestrated way. Ottawa didn't issue travel warnings or launch a counter-tariff campaign aimed at tourism. The shift was organic, a grassroots reaction from ordinary Canadians who simply had no interest in navigating a political climate where they felt unwelcome. Their collective decision, multiplied across millions of households, has now delivered more economic pressure on U.S. border towns than any formal Canadian government action could have. This trend also fits into the broader strategic landscape of 2025. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is actively diversifying its economic partnerships. The country is moving quickly to strengthen ties with Asia, tighten defense and industrial cooperation with South Korea and Japan, and reopen high-level engagement with China after APEC's unexpected diplomatic reset. At the same time, Canada is accelerating investment in critical minerals, energy infrastructure, AI-powered industries, and Arctic security. In other words, Canada is leaning into a decade-long structural shift away from dependence on the U.S. and toward a more distributed network of global partnerships. Against that backdrop, the tourism report becomes a symbol of something larger. The United States is no longer the gravitational center of Canada's economic life, and for U.S. border states, that reality is beginning to burn. Meanwhile, governors in places like Maine and New York are quietly distancing themselves from Trump's tariff strategy. They cannot afford the political cost of empty hotels and half-full restaurants. Last year's visit by Maine's Governor Janet Mills to New Brunswick, an effort to repair relations after Trump's tariff escalation, already signaled growing anxiety. Now, with the data in hand, state leaders have an even stronger case to present to Washington. The trade war isn't hurting Canada. it's hurting Americans. Perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story is how effortlessly Canada has gained leverage. By merely changing consumer behavior, Canadians have inflicted more economic pressure on the U.S. than Trump ever anticipated. This is soft power in its purest form, influence achieved not through confrontation or coercion, but through absence. When your tourists stop coming and your border towns start to empty out, that absence becomes impossible to ignore.
This report should serve as a wake-up call in Washington. U.S.-Canada relations are entering a new era, one shaped not by unquestioned alignment but by strategic independence. As Canada continues forging new partnerships in Asia and Europe, its reliance on U.S. markets inevitably shrinks. And as the U.S. leans deeper into protectionism, it unintentionally accelerates Canada's pivot. For the United States, the consequences are already visible. Border economies are now learning the hard way that Canadian visitors are not optional. They are foundational. They keep small businesses open, maintain seasonal employment, and stabilize rural communities that depend on cross-border traffic. Losing this inflow, even temporarily, exposes just how fragile some parts of the U.S. regional economy truly are. Politically, Trump now faces a growing narrative problem. His tariffs have hit U.S. farmers, strained manufacturers, and rattled global markets. Now they're hurting tourism, one of America's most employment-rich sectors. Democratic lawmakers are already seizing on the report to highlight the pattern. Trump's America First approach keeps landing hardest on America itself. And for Canada, this moment provides an unexpected insight into its own influence. The country often downplays its strategic weight, but this report makes one thing clear: Canada matters, far more than Washington sometimes remembers. The Congressional report is not just a statistical update. It is a mirror held up to U.S. policy, revealing a simple truth: treating Canada as expendable is a costly mistake. When Canadians decide to pull back, even quietly, the economic ripples stretch across multiple states, thousands of businesses, and tens of thousands of workers. For Canadians watching this shift unfold, there is a growing sense of confidence. Not arrogance, confidence. Canada does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs to act in its own interest, and the world adjusts around it. The real question now is whether Washington will adjust as well, or whether it will continue learning this lesson the hard way. Because if the trend continues into 2026, the balance of economic influence along the world's largest undefended border may look very different, and for once, the advantage may lie entirely on the northern side.
The new bill is the so-called Lost Canadians legislation, which passed the House of Commons last week. It means citizenship can be passed down to people born or adopted abroad beyond the first generation.
Given the current state of the United States administration, I think it's important to kind of have that in the back pocket.
More and more Americans are digging through old family documents, tracing forgotten ancestry, and searching for any connection to Canada they can find. And they're doing it for one reason. The United States, under Donald Trump, no longer feels stable. This week, Canada made a decision that has accelerated the shift. Ottawa expanded citizenship rights for people with Canadian lineage, and the first wave rushing toward that opportunity is coming directly from the United States.
Immigration consultants have seen a surge in interest in Canadian citizenship, but caution, it's not a rubber stamp.
It's not sort of a free-for-all type of an application, but I think it's still worth attempting for many people who see that they have either parent, grandparent, great-grandparent who may have been born in Canada.
The turning point came from a simple story. Ordinary Americans with Canadian roots discovering that, for the first time in years, they finally qualify for citizenship through ancestry. Canada's newly updated citizenship framework, designed to correct long-standing legal inconsistencies, now allows more descendants of Canadians to reclaim citizenship that previous rules had denied. Several Americans explained why they acted immediately. They described always feeling a pull toward Canada, but outdated laws had blocked them from formalizing that connection. When Ottawa expanded eligibility, they prepared their paperwork at once. Some said they intend to relocate within the next couple of years, pointing to a growing belief that the United States no longer aligns with their values or expectations for the future. One sentiment appeared repeatedly. With the political environment in the U.S. growing increasingly unpredictable, having Canadian citizenship as a backup suddenly feels essential. Immigration professionals confirm that interest from Americans has surged. Applications are rising, waiting times are lengthening, and ancestry-based inquiries are multiplying. The shift is not driven by curiosity. It is driven by concern, and that concern becomes clearer when we look at the political context shaping this moment.
Canada has always been admired by many south of the border, but this new wave is qualitatively different. People are no longer simply attracted to Canada. They are seeking stability that their own country, in their view, no longer guarantees. Donald Trump's second term has brought a renewed tightening of immigration rules, broad enforcement actions, and sweeping policy reversals. Legal uncertainty has increased for mixed-status families, dual nationals, and even long-term residents. Political polarization within the U.S. has intensified to the point where fundamental rights differ dramatically from one state to another. Many Americans now describe the national climate as erratic and exhausting. Compared to this turbulence, Canada stands out as a calm alternative. Universal health care, more predictable governance, a reputation for civility, and a political culture that avoids constant culture war battles have made the country especially attractive to Americans who feel overwhelmed by their domestic situation. For those with even a distant Canadian ancestor, the option of citizenship is no longer abstract, it feels like a lifeline. This is not an exaggeration. It is the emerging mood among a growing share of middle-class American families, young professionals, and people who no longer see long-term security in the U.S.
Canada's decision to modernize its citizenship laws could not have come at a more strategic moment. For years, the old rules restricting citizenship transmission to the first generation born abroad left many people in legal limbo. Individuals with real, meaningful Canadian roots had no pathway to citizenship simply because their connection fell on the wrong side of a bureaucratic line. The new framework, introduced under Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, extends citizenship eligibility to more descendants of Canadians, provided their Canadian parent or ancestor maintained a substantial connection to Canada. The reform corrects past inconsistencies and reflects the reality of a globally mobile Canadian diaspora. But beyond its technical merits, this reform reinforces Canada's identity. It signals that Canada remains a country that values fairness, inclusion, and stable rule of law institutions, qualities that stand in stark contrast to the volatility many Americans see at home. While the United States tightens, Canada opens. While the U.S. debates who belongs, Canada clarifies how belonging is recognized. That contrast is now reshaping cross-border movement.
What we are seeing now is not an isolated reaction. It is part of a broader pattern that has been quietly gaining momentum. More Americans are applying for permanent residency, ancestry-based citizenship, and even asylum than in previous years. Skilled professionals in healthcare, education, clean energy, and technology are increasingly looking north for long-term security. Many say they no longer trust the direction of U.S. policy, especially in areas touching on rights, healthcare access, and social stability. Canada, without needing to advertise itself, has become a refuge of predictability in a chaotic global environment. Even with domestic challenges, housing pressures, healthcare bottlenecks, Canada is still viewed by many Americans as safer, calmer, and more coherent. The brand of Canada is rising, not because Canada has changed dramatically, but because the United States has. This shift carries symbolic weight. It suggests that North America's gravitational center, at least in terms of social stability and institutional trust, is tilting northward.
For Canada, this moment presents both opportunity and responsibility.
The country faces an aging population, persistent labor shortages, and growing demand for skilled workers across multiple sectors. Descendants of Canadians in the United States represent a unique pool of potential newcomers, individuals who are culturally aligned, fluent in English, and able to transition seamlessly into Canadian society. Their arrival is not merely beneficial on an economic level, it enriches Canada's global networks, strengthens the Canadian diaspora, and reinforces Canada's position as a stable hub in an increasingly fractured world. While other nations turn inward, Canada gains strength by remaining open, carefully, strategically, and responsibly. This alignment of domestic needs and geopolitical shifts places Canada in a remarkably strong position. It can welcome talent at the very moment its closest neighbor is driving that talent away.
For the United States, however, the trend is deeply revealing. When citizens of any country begin proactively seeking alternative citizenship as a safeguard, it signals erosion in institutional confidence. That erosion is now visible among Americans with the means, education, and mobility to choose another path. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. A growing number of Americans now see Canada, once considered the quieter partner in North America, as the more stable, reliable place to build a future. If this perception continues, the U.S. could face long-term consequences: loss of skilled labor, international reputational damage, and internal fragmentation as families seek opportunities elsewhere. Canada did not create America's turbulence, but Canada is absorbing its fallout, and doing so with calm assurance.
Canada's expanded citizenship rules mark more than a legislative change. They reflect a profound divergence in the trajectories of two neighboring countries. One nation, Trump's America, is tightening, polarizing, and shaking the confidence of its own people. The other, Canada, is opening, stabilizing, and providing a foundation of trust that more and more Americans now seek. As applications continue to rise and more individuals rediscover long-forgotten Canadian roots, a larger question emerges. If Americans are turning to Canada for stability, security, and sanity, what does that say about the state of the United States today?
President-elect Donald Trump's comments about one of Canada's most valued natural resources.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
Donald Trump has made many provocative claims throughout his political life, but few have struck Canadians more deeply than his suggestion that the United States should one day access Canada's freshwater reserves. And for many in Canada, the moment felt familiar because Trump's fixation on Canada is not new.
I love Canada. Frankly, Canada should be the 51st state.
His earlier comments about turning Canada into America's 51st state reveal just how casually he imagines Canadian territory and resources as extensions of U.S. interests.
It's not for sale, won't be for sale, ever.
Prime Minister Mark Carney pushed back with one of the clearest statements of his leadership so far: Canada is not for sale. It was a declaration of sovereignty aimed directly at Trump, and it carried an unmistakable nuance, a quiet but firm reminder that Canada values the integrity of its territorial sovereignty, and that includes its water. These are not assets that can be casually claimed, politically pressured, or folded into someone else's agenda. This isn't a normal cross-border argument. It's a preview of a much larger struggle looming over North America. A struggle shaped by tariffs, trade leverage, climate instability, resource scarcity, and the hard limits of what even a superpower can demand from its closest ally.
The controversy resurfaced when Trump's earlier remarks began circulating again. Comments painting Canada as a country with millions of gallons of water pouring down like a giant faucet, and hinting that the United States should eventually secure long-term access to that supply. With the American West deep in another year of extreme drought, those words landed differently.
States like Arizona, Nevada, and California are approaching the limits of their water systems after years of shrinking snowpack, collapsing reservoirs, and relentless heat. Lake Mead hovers near historic lows, the Colorado River is under unprecedented strain, and major cities from Phoenix to Las Vegas are spending billions on recycling and desalination just to keep pace. In that increasingly desperate environment, Trump's idea resonates with some Americans who see Canada as a land of endless lakes and untapped rivers. U.S. commentators and policy groups have begun reviving old visions of continental water pipelines and cross-border water-sharing agreements, framing Canada as a natural solution to America's drying future. But in Ottawa, the reaction followed a very different logic. The renewed talk of accessing Canadian water fit neatly into a broader pattern, the same pattern seen in Trump's 51st state rhetoric, where Canadian territory and resources were spoken of as if they could be absorbed into American plans. Carney avoided the theatrics this time, but his stance remained unmistakably consistent. Canada's sovereignty is not for negotiation, and that principle extends fully to its natural resources. Ottawa made clear that Canada alone decides how its land and its water are used, not Washington, and certainly not the political imagination of any U.S. administration.
The desperation gripping the American Southwest is well documented. Reuters, AP, and NOAA all show a structural decline in water availability, shrinking reservoirs, shrinking farmland, and cities negotiating seasonal survival. In that setting, the idea of drawing water from Canada feels increasingly logical to many Americans who see Canadian lakes and rivers as an untapped surplus. Trump's language amplifies that belief by framing Canadian water as if it were simply flowing across a border waiting to be shared. Policy groups in Washington have even revived old proposals for continental pipelines, borrowing the mindset that built North America's oil and gas networks. If energy can move across borders, why not water? For Canada, that logic is not just flawed, it sets a dangerous precedent. Canadians have long rejected the myth that the country has limitless water. Scientific assessments from the University of British Columbia, Statistics Canada, and Environment Canada all point to the same conclusion. The majority of Canada's freshwater is not renewable, not easily accessible, and not available in the quantities outsiders imagine. Much of it sits in northern regions, far from population centers or locked inside glaciers that are themselves shrinking. Carney knows this scientific reality. He also knows the political one. Canada has spent decades defending its natural resources, lumber, dairy, minerals, and energy, against American trade challenges. The moment something becomes an export commodity, the rules change. Corporations gain leverage, international trade law becomes involved, and the United States, with its massive political and economic weight, gains new channels to push for access. That is why, even without the dramatic phrasing, Carney's position on water was unmistakably tough. When he pushed back against Trump in the 51st state moment, he wasn't just defending national pride. He was defending the principle that Canada, not Washington, decides what Canada is. Today's water issue is simply another attempt to draw Canada into an American frame, and Carney responded by reminding everyone that Canadian resources exist under Canadian governance. Even if Canada entertained the idea, the environmental toll would be severe. Freshwater systems are interconnected and fragile. Redirecting water from one basin to another risks destabilizing fish stocks, draining wetlands, and permanently altering river flow. Canada's major watersheds, from the Great Lakes to the Mackenzie, already face mounting pressure from rising temperatures and industrial expansion. Scientists warn that once large-scale exports begin, the political and economic momentum becomes nearly impossible to reverse. What starts as a temporary solution can harden into a permanent obligation, backed by infrastructure and cross-border expectations.
Climate change is reshaping geopolitics, and water is emerging as the new pressure point. Trump's second-term agenda already strains Canada through tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and agricultural goods. Water, even if not formally demanded, now sits in the background as a strategic interest the U.S. may pursue as drought deepens. Carney's approach seeks to close that door before it becomes a negotiation. By grounding the debate in sovereignty rather than emotion, he reinforces Canada's political position and connects today's issue to past provocations like the 51st state remark. It sends a clear message: Canada will not be redefined by American expectations or political fantasies.
The clash between Trump and Carney over water is not a trivial dispute. It is a first chapter in a future where nations will battle not over trade deals or tariffs, but over fundamental resources that determine survival. Canada's stance reflects a deeper strategy: protect what must be protected now before climate pressure turns questions into demands. The United States will continue facing a worsening water crisis, and its leaders, Trump or otherwise, may return to Canada with new proposals. The real question is how Canada prepares for that moment and whether it can safeguard its sovereignty in a world where water is emerging as the most strategic resource of the century.
If you poke a bear, they might strike back. And maybe that's the key takeaway. You know, the fact of the matter is for many Canadians, there's not much that they can do on an individual basis except boycotting, avoiding buying U.S. goods, or avoiding or delaying travel to the United States. And it looks like a significant proportion of Canadians not only are doing that, but believe that it is helpful or somewhat helpful.
Across Canada, a quiet but powerful wave of resistance is still rolling. Months after President Trump's sweeping import duties triggered a North American trade war, the boycott of U.S. goods and tourism has not disappeared. It is still growing. In supermarkets from Halifax to Vancouver, shoppers are reading the fine print on every label. Families planning winter trips to Florida are changing their destinations. Local stores now proudly display signs saying, "Made in Canada," and the message behind them is unmistakable. Canadians are choosing their side.
According to a new Nanos research poll, 4 out of 5 Canadians say that boycotting American-made stuff or avoiding tourism to the United States altogether will strengthen our country's bargaining position in the ongoing trade war launched by President Trump.
According to a new Nanos research poll released in October 2025, 4 out of 5 Canadians, roughly 80% of the population, believe that refusing to buy American products or avoiding travel to the United States strengthens Canada's bargaining position in the trade dispute launched by Washington earlier this year. Only 18% said the boycott is not helpful. What began as a policy fight between governments has become a movement of everyday citizens using their spending power as a form of quiet defiance. In a country known for moderation and diplomacy, this is a striking show of national unity.
When the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, furniture, and auto parts in early 2025, the intention was to force Ottawa into concessions. But the impact went beyond government offices and boardrooms. It reached directly into households. The numbers tell the story. In February, new import duties ranging from 10 to 35% were imposed under U.S. national security rules. By mid-year, the U.S. Department of Commerce reported that the average input cost in the auto sector had already risen by more than 12%. For Canada, a country whose manufacturing corridor depends on cross-border supply chains, this was devastating. Factories struggled and border paperwork multiplied, yet instead of backing down, Canadians began to adapt. A consumer shift took hold. Older Canadians led the charge. 85% of those aged 55 and above told Nanos Research they support the boycott. Among those aged 35 to 54, 74% agreed. Support was strongest in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, where local industries have been hardest hit by the tariffs. What makes this moment different is the scope of participation. It is not limited to activists or politicians. Ordinary citizens, retirees, and small business owners are joining the movement. Even travel data shows a tangible decline in Canadian tourism to the United States, especially in border states like Vermont, Michigan, and New York. Tourism agencies in those areas have begun warning of lower bookings and declining retail sales. A strategy meant to isolate Canada is now hurting communities across the U.S. that depend on Canadian visitors.
The boycott has turned into something larger than a consumer reaction. It has become a political signal. Trump's tariffs were supposed to pressure Ottawa by weakening its economy. Instead, they have strengthened the idea of economic independence. In practical terms, 3 consequences are now visible. First, consumer backlash. Canadians have internalized the dispute. Each purchase or canceled trip has become an act of self-assertion. Second, economic spillover. U.S. businesses near the border are feeling the loss of Canadian customers, especially in tourism and retail. Reports from regional chambers of commerce show significant declines in cross-border spending since the summer. Third, political momentum. The boycott gives Prime Minister Mark Carney's government greater leverage in ongoing negotiations with Washington ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Public opinion is now firmly behind him. Data from the Nanos poll also reveals a supermajority effect. 54% of Canadians called the boycott very helpful, and another 26% say it is somewhat helpful. Combined, that's an overwhelming national consensus rarely seen in modern politics. The Trump administration may not have anticipated this. By using tariffs to project strength, it has sparked a collective determination among Canadians to protect their own markets. The White House expected economic pressure. Instead, it has encountered a surge of unity that crosses age, region, and political lines.
The ripple effects are already visible. For decades, Canada's economy was deeply intertwined with the United States, from auto parts in Ontario to grain exports in the prairies and energy shipments from Alberta. Now that dependence is being reevaluated. In response to trade uncertainty, Ottawa is encouraging a Buy Canadian strategy across public procurement while exploring new export partnerships with the European Union and several Asian economies. The government is also using this moment to mobilize U.S. border states, reminding them that Canadian consumers are vital to their own economic stability. Within Canada, the boycott has taken on symbolic power. It represents more than protest. It signals a shift in national confidence, that Canadians, as individuals, can influence the direction of trade policy through their collective choices. In a global economy dominated by superpowers, that sense of agency is rare. Meanwhile, for Washington, the consequences are growing harder to ignore. Cross-border travel is down, tourism revenue in key U.S. regions has slipped, and public sentiment in Canada has hardened. Each of these developments chips away at the soft power the U.S. once enjoyed across its northern border. In trying to teach Canada a lesson, Trump has instead taught Canadians something else, that resilience and economic loyalty can be a form of sovereignty. The boycott may have started as a small act of frustration, but today it stands as a symbol of how ordinary people can shape the balance of power in a trade war.